Thank you for your invitation. Je vais dire quelques mots en français pour commencer, parce que je me réjouis de voir des visages connus dans un amphithéâtre inconnu et qui a enfin vu le jour. Donc ça fait plaisir, doublement plaisir d'être ici, et je suis aussi content de partager ce moment, share this moment with our friends from the United States. Usually I prefer to stand when I'm talking, but for various reasons I'm going to sit, so please forgive me for being immobile for a while. You may infer from the title, which is a very long title, that I'm going to be very long, but I'm not sure about that, we'll see. You may also infer that it has little to do with the broad designation of the event to which we are taking part, authoritarianism, etc. And I guess if you think like this, you may be wrong. And I try to show how it is related to the two other presentations that we'll have after mine. In France, there is a surprising resistance to using political psychology in political science. Actually, political psychology doesn't exist as such. I mean, people know social psychology. And they make a lot of quotations from this bunch of research, but not much from political psychology, or it is very recent. So I try to say a few words about why it is so, and because of what I'm going to say, it's going to be probably something enduring. And sorry, oh, nice song. And then also I will show some of the findings of the 10 years or so of collective research that we had, as you mentioned, Sonia, at the very beginning. Yes, on cognition, perceptions, memory, etc., and especially what eventually became not political knowledge and its impact on political behavior, but resistance to persuasion when we have quasi-experiments and try to stimulate people with two counter-arguments. It will be too long to explain the whole design, but I give you some insight about that. Well, I already had an opportunity to present something with Jean-Louis Marie from Lyon on resistance to psychology in French political science in front of Georges in Paris. But since then, it came to my mind that the main reason was that the two dominant disciplines in the social sciences, when we are trying to address things which are more or less psychological, are economics and sociology. And both, for various reasons, don't like psychology, and we are not easily convinced that we should use psychology in political science. Why? There is no dialogue with political science. In economics, people are even full of contempt for those who, not you, Raoul, I know, who are sometimes using economics in their own research, but most don't, and most political scientists don't, and most economists just think that this is not true science. And they are, I guess, they have some authority on the social sciences in France right now. I'm trying to show that it's also because they are more or less authoritarian, not the personalities themselves, but the fact that the very idea they have of how you make a decision on public issues or on private affairs is a matter of having some sort of an authentic opinion or a choice, and trying to make the best use, find the most utility possible of your opinion. And so you don't need to debate, or you should not debate, which is another way to put the thing. My point, of course, is that with our psychology, we could not explain political campaign, not only electoral campaigns, but political campaigns like debate on climate change, which is not quite linked to the next elections, and electoral campaigns certainly. Let's start with resistance to psychology. Just think of what an election is and see that, you may easily find out that in France, the answers we have to these questions are not non-psychological. Viewed from economics, it's just an aggregation of preferences. So you find people at the École Polytechnique who design models to explain or predict political behavior and electoral behavior using this model of aggregation of preferences. So that means, of course, that people are choosing rationally, and they don't need to discuss with other people to see or check that their choice is rational, because it's rational per se. Then you have the general will, which comes from Rousseau and is against individual choice, and I'm going to develop this in a moment. Also, actually, it's something which is sometimes unknown or just ignored by most people. That also said that if you organize the vote, then you have the people who are against and people who are for, and the pro are coming from the left, and the against are coming from the right, and they don't talk to each other. Absolutely not, because what you need is to know what is the true collective opinion, and that's the general will. And so if you have a debate, then people are going to be manipulated. They will change their minds. Some will switch from the left to the right, and vice versa. And so the idea is that you need to collect something which is a general will. The only way to do it is to go down into the conscience of everyone without any debate. Durkheim? Well, it's a little weird to have this couple here, Rousseau and Durkheim, but Durkheim is also against something like, if not self-reflection, it's also it's a possibility to think about the things you are doing and what your convictions are and what you really want, because there is this idea that the collective consciousness is something which weighs on your shoulder without knowing it, and that is something which actually determining for your vote. So you don't have to exchange views, you don't have to discuss, and if you do, it doesn't matter anyway. It's not going to change the whole outcome. This, of course, for me is leading to the tyranny of the majority, because in the two cases of Rousseau and Durkheim, what you have is depiction of what the political stage is, and it's a political stage which is more or less authoritarian. Once you have one more vote than the other camp, then the winner takes all, and we know what does that mean in the Brexit issue, and now probably with Catalonia. Resistance to psychology is also very ancient and durable in France because of Durkheim. As you know, Durkheim built his own, established himself as a guru in French social sciences, the French social sciences of his time, by, in a way, putting the psychologists of his time in a very weak position. And he tried to develop a social science which would include everything and would be which would not need to use any individual factor, including psychological factor. So you remember the suicide. The suicide is collective fact. I mean, people can suicide for various reasons. It doesn't matter. I mean, Durkheim doesn't care. I mean, whatever the reason for which you suicide, and the letters of motivation that you leave to those who are still behind you, it doesn't matter. So the authenticity and the sincerity, the fact that your feelings are expressed in the correct way by your vote is not a problem for Durkheim, and shouldn't be in the social sciences as he conceives them. Now, in the COGKnee group that Sonia mentioned, for Stéphanie, I think we started in 2002, and probably the first collection of data was in 2003, and so for about 10 years until we presented final report to a number of people, among whom we find George Marcus here. And then we are still working on this data and processing them again and again. We worked on various aspects of what I call the opinion elasticity. The fact that opinion change evolves, and that it evolves because there are arguments and counter-arguments which are heard, and that you can express your views and be contested by others. You can check that you are right. You can check that you can test the determination of the others, etc. And that's what eventually makes you sticking to one opinion. And so you may have the same opinion at the end than before you started thinking. But actually, there is a whole process of testing your own opinion and testing the opinion of the other, and achieving some sort of an agreement with yourself on whatever you think about a public issue. So we worked on the percentage of opinion change by category of people, like experts who has a very good political knowledge, has a particular ratio of opinion change, and those people who are rather unsophisticated have another ratio. And so we came out with some sort of like 4 groups instead of those who know, those who don't know. So it's a gradation of people with various attributes, and I'm going to skip this, of course, because I don't have time to do this. The explanatory variable that we measured, of course, demographics as anyone else, the cognitive process, how you get your knowledge, how you memorize it, and how you retrieve your memory when you need it. Political curiosity, I'll come back to this in a moment, and also the emotions and personality. In the last phase of our research, we turned to personality, and so we are working now with the same authors, co-authors that were mentioned by Sonia, Alessandro Nai and Jean-Louis Marie, on a paper on personality. There are also other variables that are of some concern, but that we are not going to discuss here. The left-right scale. Actually, it doesn't play much of a role. That's part of the issue. I mean, we will always say, what about the ideology? About the involvement, political involvement? And then you see, all right, and we measured that. But it doesn't make much sense compared to political knowledge, compared to emotions, etc. And also issue saliency, which is quite different and difficult to measure. But in the Swiss survey, for example, we did that in order to know if people were really concerned by the discussion that we had. Because, people are usually very respectful of those that interview them, and they want to be contributive, and so they say, yes, we are. But in a way, in a face-to-face pilot survey that we made with a number of people for about an hour home, we have understood that for a number of them, I mean, the issue at stake was not an important one. I mean, it didn't come on top of the list of their concerns, but they really gently answered to our questions because they thought that they should do something for people coming from the university and making some important social research. We also had control variables, like what I call political curiosity, which is both awareness, because you are informed, you have interest in politics, and you can discuss with your peers. And we measured a very interesting variable. Did you have discussions with your parents at 15? And that's a very important variable, which brings some interesting findings. Political sophistication, well, the usual suspects are knowledge, performance. We mean that you know relevant things about the questions that are raised. And education, understood here not at only the level of education with a degree, ultimate degree that you got, but also as the process of being trained in cognitive things, which eventually put you, if you are a PhD, hopefully, in a different position than if you are illiterate. Our surveys, well, eventually we reached a total aggregated number of 2,700, which is actually rather significant, and also we measured and controlled for statistical significance at every level. But of course, it's not the same public. The audience were different, and we did this in a span time of 7 years. So it's not like if we had a 2,700 sample, but it helps you understand that we have some data. This is the experiment, and I cannot, of course, do better than show you how complex it is. I mean, you have people who, there is split ballot. So there are people who answer yes or no, and then you go on the algorithm, go on that way down to the bottom. And at each step, we have arguments and counter-arguments. So if people think that they get through or they can muddle through the discussion with good arguments, and then we come with another one, which is still, from our viewpoint, better than the previous one. And they are, again, tested. They have to make up their mind and see if this second argument is even more convincing than the first one. And they also sometimes have to say why they are not convinced by argument that they find convincing, because that's also something which happens most of the time. They say, well, it's a very good argument, very convincing. Yes, well, you did change your mind. No, because I have other reasons why I don't want to change my mind. You know, I'm not the person who changed mine easily, or I know other arguments which are as convincing as yours, etc., etc. So we did this for the whole samples, and each sample was processed that way. And this brought interesting results in some sort of an experiment, a quasi-experiment, by the way, because the computer, which is a computer-assisted telephone interview, the computer dispatches people according to their answers, and eventually you have quite a number of additional data stemming from the 2,700 people interviewed, because each one produces a large number of data. What are the psychological factors which matter in explaining the results that we found? Let's start with cognition. For a while, cognition is perception. Perception means, of course, there is some sort of framing of the situation, in which type of situation I'm heading, and what will happen next, etc. So you may start feeling actually a little nervous or not, or very enthusiastic about what will follow. You may be just blasé, or you think that you are learning a lot, etc. Memory, very difficult to assess, actually. And of course, I guess psychologists are well equipped to find out how you retrieve your memory individually with a lot of tools that we don't have in political science, by the way. It's not like Minnesota. we probably need to have more tools and have time to use them, money to buy them sometimes. And so memory is something that we actually addressed from the mergers. And what I call embodied knowledge, which is the knowledge that you accumulated with time, according to your education and the type of situation in which you were. And so in the context in which you were, you learn a number of things. So if you lived in Damascus, for example, just before the war started there are a number of accumulated knowledge, experience about Syrian affairs that play a role in your way and your opinion about what, for example, the French government should do about Syria. Emotions. Affects and feelings. Affects is, well, the affect effects and affective intelligence. The affects is something like, a global keyword for everything which includes emotion, feelings, whatsoever. But we can use it in a more restrictive way, saying there are affects which are more or less reflex, or something which can be unconscious, self-sustaining, etc. And there are also feelings which are like sentiment, the sentimental citizen, someone who may have some sort of a spleen about his own position, and I was on the left and I vote on the right, on the contrary, and so it's terrible, etc. And reactions to stimuli, like the kind of arguments that we gave to people, and we want to know how they react to it, how they're surprised, worrying about what we say, and the information we bring to them, etc. And then personality. Well, personality, for those who don't know what the big five are, it's because you are not at the core of political psychology. Because in psychology itself, in psychology, everyone knows what the big five are. Of course, there are discussions about the possible big six, or sometimes ahead of us in a few years from now, probably 7 or 8, I don't know. But there is a consensus that you can put the people into psychological categories in which they share quite a number of attributes. And the consensus, or the conventional wisdom right now, is that there are 5 categories, and I show these categories to you in a minute. Now, with our data, we found these 5 categories, the same categories as these categories that are usually called the big 5 in the literature. But we also found 4 types, with 4 different types of personality traits. And these 4 types are a little different from the 5, of course. And the interesting thing, I tell it, and it's on the, well, I would say, I'm going now on the back road of this presentation, but if you use methodological tools which are very usual in Europe, especially in France, then you find out that there are 4 types, that you are sure that the 4 types exist. Now, if you use the regressions, logistical regressions that are very fashionable in the United States, etc., you have your big 5. So it may also be a matter of the kind of tools that you use. Emotions. Here, George Marcus is a role model for all those who worked on anxiety and anger, because he published a lot on these 2 types of emotions. And mainly, just to be brief, I mean, if you are anxious, you really want to test your opinion and be more informed until you are sure of whatever you think and you will do. And if you are angry, you just immediately jump to the conclusion that someone should be judged, killed, you should terrorize someone or send troops somewhere. We could not, of course, measure anxiety and anger directly, because if you have to do this, you need the battery of something like a series of something like 20 to 40 questions. And if you have a questionnaire which lasts for about 35, 40, 45 minutes, and then you already have something like 60 or 70 questions. I mean, if you really had to single out a series of psychological questions just to make sure that in the end you will be able to tell a mainstream psychologist that you are sure of your data, then it will be impossible to fund and even to implement. So what we have is surprise and concern. For example, if you say to someone, you know that the climate is changing, then there is this global warming effect. Do you have an idea of what is the figure which corresponds to the global warming? For example, is it 2%, 4% higher in 2020 or 2050 than it is now? And then you have a number of answers. And then you give the right answer, exactly the right answer. And then you have a number of people who say, well, I'm surprised. And then you want to know if they are worrying about that. And then again, you have people who say, well, I don't care. Well, you know, in 2050 I will be dead or whatever. I mean, that's not an issue. We find solutions, and eventually waste and energy substitutes will make the job, whatever. But there are also people who say, well, I'm very much concerned about that. Very much concerned about that. And it's something which is very important for me. So if you combine surprise, no, that's not possible, because I have something which is I have 20 minutes. When I talk 20 minutes, then it rings. So you give me 30 minutes.
When you talk 20 minutes, it rings?
Yeah, it will ring. Normally, if it works. If it works.
Maybe you switch the
Well, I'm going to straight to the end of my presentation. So we have surprise and concern, and combined we can they use our proxies for anger and anxiety. Now, what are the relationship between emotions and elasticity? I mean, elasticity of opinion elasticity. You can easily draw from our findings this conclusion that if you are calm, it's more important in determining what kind of reaction you will have when you are exposed to counter-arguments than if you are very knowledgeable. But the combination of both plus an interest in politics and the issue at stakes in particular makes you adopt a particular type of behavior. And this is the result. If you are among the less sophisticated people and you are anxious, then you are less likely to resist persuasions. And you are anxious and you are not very knowledgeable. So someone like an expert tells you that this is the end of the world in 20 years from now. And so you say, all right, I was wrong. I rally your opinion. Now, if you are very sophisticated, if you are an expert, you know a number of things on the issue and also on politics in general, then what you tend to do is that you stick to your arguments. Now, an interesting thing is that you take time to make sure that your arguments are correct. So we measured, for example, the answering time. And the answering time is interesting because in the literature, the assumption is that if you know exactly why you are convinced by your opinion, then whatever the counter-arguments and information is brought to you, you immediately answer. You know the answer, so why should you wait? Well, what we found out is quite the contrary. Well, I'm sure I know the answer, but now I want to test. I want to give you a guest, educated opinion about what you are trying to make me say, and so I'm really longer than usual. The anxious sophisticates, of course, if you give them relevant information, and because they already have relevant information, they can reject persuasion, however smart you are in trying to persuade them. And so they change less opinion than any other category. Okay, we are going to skip this. But if you now use the control variables, political interest and political knowledge on the left, what you see is that the more knowledgeable you are, the less probable it is that you will change your opinion. And the more interested in politics you are, the less probable it is, the less likely it is that you are going to change your opinion. So these two control variables bring something additional to your emotional states and to any other determination from your socioeconomic status, education level, etc. And here is the combination of anxiety and knowledge. And as you see on the left scale, you have the probability of opinion change. And on the bottom line, you have the level of political knowledge. So 10 on the right and 0 on the left. And as you see, the level of opinion change increases with the level of anxiety, with the level of political knowledge, but anxiety is probably the dotted line on the top. The same with anxiety and interest in politics. So it's probably the same, absolutely not different from whatever we have seen so far. So anxiety brings something additional to what we already have when you forget about demographics and you think about political interest and political concern and political knowledge. Now, personality. I try to be quick. Does anyone know what this is? No, you don't. Okay. It's a very recent publications by people who work on guppies. Guppies are Trinidadian guppies, are small redfish. And so they made an experience with redfishes. So they had them in an aquarium, and then they put one by one each of these fishes in another aquarium where there was nothing else but a very small plastic refuge, and everything else was transparent. And then they used a wooden heron, which they just dipped into the water, and they see what were the reactions of the 8 fishes that they had selected after a long process of etc. And so they found out that there were some fishes were freezing. They didn't move with the hope that the heron wouldn't find them. Others were taking refuge, hiding out behind the plastic. And some others were just going like this, zigzag, thinking that it would be too difficult for the heron to find them because they were very quick. The interesting thing is that experience after experience, the same fishes behaved exactly the same way with the heron and with net that was an avian net that was used to take them from the big aquarium to the small aquarium and back. But at some times it was also very stressful to see this net. So personality matters even for trillidae and guppies, redfishes. So it should work also for humans. This is the big 5. Well, there are a number of very humoristic presentations of the big 5. So you can go to Google and see. But here is the depiction of what the big 5s are. And so I guess probably the presentation will be disseminated or passed to or whatever. I mean, you get an opportunity to see this in private and that, with more time to reflect on this. And the distinction is whatever is listed here. So these are the 5 types. I belong, I guess, to conscientiousness and sometimes neuroticism. Again, skip this. And also skip that just to show you that there are differences because each of these boxes addresses one of the personality traits and the personality type. And you see that they differ very much from each other. So the interesting thing now is how all the... I come back to our own findings, the small 4. That's a different list. As you see, we have the liberals, the authoritarians, the introverts, and the adventurers, risk takers. Each one behave in a different way from the others as far as the questionnaire that we had is concerned, and we find different findings for each. And again, I skip this just to show you that we mean business because we have the data which fits my main arguments, assumptions here. My conclusions, so it didn't ring, definitely. My conclusions, of course, perceptions, emotions, and personality matter, but we should not forget that the deliberative design is important. In our quasi-experiment, we have a particular deliberative design, and in the end, most of the people we interviewed, when we tried to reflect with them after the interview on how the interview was felt at the end, and they all said, well, very interesting. For the first time ever, I had time to discuss with people very interesting things, and I've never had an opportunity to answer such type of questions, and I thank you for doing this, etc., University of X or Y. And this is because they think that they can freely express their views, that it's a fair design, that nobody is going to be cheated by it. And also, it's an experiment in a way. It doesn't exist in real life. In real life, you feel that you may be cheated by people, manipulated by others, and sometimes you can be punished if you express a view, for example, like being a racist. Then you will find out that your neighbors know that you had this view is expressed, and they will make you pay for that. So if individuals have to express sincerely and correctly, meaning that their true opinion, which is reflected by their vote eventually, they must feel that it's a fair design and that they have time to test their opinion. They have time for a discussion, which will be more like a conversation than like a political debate when people insult themselves mutually. And we come to your presentation, which will come next. deliberation and democracy, when arguments and counter-arguments are exchanged, the probability that we live in an authoritarian world and that eventually the policy measures that will be taken will be authoritarian from top to down and not bottom up are less likely. I mean, it's less likely. Because if you aggregate all this micro-public in which people freely think that they can express their views, test their opinion, change opinion sometimes. I always, I started from the very beginning telling you that people don't change their opinion much, but at the very least we made 30% of them change overall, which is nearly 1/3 of the samples that we have at various occasions in 2 countries, France and Switzerland. So it's not minor anyway. We cannot just neglect that. And authoritarian personalities could not manipulate people as easily. So what I'm at now is trying to find out a design which would help France, for example, to have a way to improve its democratic process with a deliberative process, and which is rather advanced, but it's too early to give you even some insights about it until I'm sure about what kind of lessons I can draw from this experiment. Suppose we could invent such an electoral systems at the national level, then I guess that these authoritarian personalities, which would like to have an authoritarian system probably established in their own country and probably elsewhere, like in Putin's, Erdogan's, and Duarte's and others' kingdoms, then I guess with such a design we would do better. So this is how I justify the fact that we spent so many years working on data, on political knowledge, then on cognition as a process and not as a stock, then on the role of emotions, and then on the role of personality. And in the end, we may now probably suggest some solutions to the democratic dilemma. And that's the end. I keep it.
Thank you very much, Yves, for this very interesting presentation on political psychology in France, and particularly your most recent work on persuasion in combination with groupies or personality traits.
We are not redfish, are we?
Political knowledge and interest. Well, of course, we would like to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. So please, go ahead. Are there any questions? Yes. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for this presentation. I think that it's a huge model, and it's nice to see that there is interaction between meta variables like personality, emotion, and cognition. My question is about the manipulation that you had done of the anxiety variable. And do you think that surprise can prime anxiety? And if it is true, it is durable over time, because maybe the idea behind my question is that surprise maybe anchor new knowledge, political knowledge, because you're surprised, so you will begin to think about the stuff, so you can develop your knowledge, and the anxiety is maybe not durable. I don't know. Just
Okay. Well, as I said, surprise plus worry or concern is a combined index, integrated index of something. What? Well, there is, we know, anxiety or anger or a combination of both that is just behind. So if we find that people are surprised and worrying about any issue, that means that they really start to be stressful. They are not in a calm condition anymore. And that's the problem with, I would say that psychology has this advantage of showing you that it is important for people in politics to know if they are in a calm condition or in a stressful condition, because we know, thanks to psychology, that they always want to go back to the calm situation. So it's like people who don't know how to vote eventually will vote as usual, because once they get out of the polls, they will feel relieved and back again to the old business. And I'm not sure about what they did exactly, but I mean, they feel well. And I guess that's what the type of effect we stimulate. So there are other answers to your question, but I mean, that's mainly what I can say as that phase.
Thank you. Further questions from the floor?
Maybe we could ask the baby over there. Maybe he has something to say that will revolutionize the field. You never know what to expect from early socialization. So.
At 15 months now, you know, next time we have a question, did you have political discussions at 15 months?
The baby has nothing to say. I may add a few words. First, I cannot help but say that you've been quite unfair with Durkheim. I mean, Durkheim tells us many things and gives us many indications on how to relate sociology to psychology. Think for example, about this typology of altruistic and fatalist suicides. And also, you're quite unfair with the French sociologists, which have also been very influenced by Schemeil. And Schemeil wrote interesting things on sociology and psychology. But that was not the point I wanted to raise. My point was more about what you call opinion elasticity, and how you would relate this notion to notions which are more usual in the field, such as ambivalence. Ambivalence is the fact that you all, at the same time, positive and negative views toward the same attitudinal object, or with the fact that people can have at the same time authoritarian predisposition and tolerant predisposition. So that's what you call opinion elasticity. Has something to do with that?
That's you know, the question is leading to something very long and complicated, so I try to be as brief as possible. It's that you have findings which point out positive and negative emotions, the same type of emotion. So here, of course, you cannot have any insight about that, but we try to see the difference between something like, you know, anxiety in a way is a positive emotion because it leads you to move ahead, where anger is just a negative emotion because it is leading you to just to react in a silly way anyway. I mean, you don't think it over, and you just buy the first argument that you hear. But you're right, that's an important path for further exploration of this type of findings. And also it's very complicated. About Schemeil, in the written presentation I wrote before I made this PowerPoint, Schemeil was there, of course, and Weber too. But I guess the prominence of Durkheimian legacy, the Durkheimian legacy on the French political sociology, relayed by Bourdieu. This is an important statement. Relayed by Bourdieu made sociologists think that everything psychological is individual. Anything individual is at the very least, or at least provisionally, temporary, it's something which should be left out because sociology is too complicated to make. And now if you enter into the details, then you are going to be lost. And of course, on that account, Schemeil is not different from Durkheim because when he looks at the Battle of Marathon, he says that if you really want to explain it, you should have some way of measuring the sweating of the soldiers, their degree of exhaustion, how their muscles are reacting after 2 hours or 3 hours of battle, each one, and what they have in mind while they are fighting. You know, so like my wife is cheating on me, it's terrible, so I'm going to kill that man because I'm angry, etc. I mean, of course, you never reach such a situation, never. So you have to get rid of it, be very parsimonious. And so for the sake of parsimony, there are quite a number of things that you let down. And so French political sociologists let down, I put it very bluntly, anything else than demographics. Eventually, yeah, les variables lourdes. Pas de chrysanthème pour les variables lourdes. We all know that, Donna Mayer's famous statements, but they are still there. So what we found in this survey, on these surveys, is that the very heavy variables didn't play a role. But education, now this, even gender didn't play a role.
Any further questions? Questions from the floor? No? So then maybe I may ask the last question. But I was very intrigued by your last suggestion of this deliberative design, and then once people really have around the arena to exchange arguments, that maybe even where they are authoritarian personalities, their influence is much less, well, not as strong as it usually would be. So thinking now of the French political system, I still consider myself very much as an outsider, but having observed the kind of political revolution that took place just a few months ago, is there some evolvement, in your opinion, where we may already observe some kind of development where the authoritarian or more authoritarian structures in politics in France give way to a more deliberative run?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's structural in France, that the state is designed.
For the La République en Marche, I mean, what they really succeeded in doing was quite amazing.
Yeah, okay.
Probably based on exchanges of arguments.
It may be a one-shot. We don't know. I mean, we'll see what will happen next. But I mean, the state is built in such a way in France, and there is such a long history of that the debates which matter are the debates within the people who are in charge of policy making within the administration. And so whatever happens outside the administration is important, makes people evolve inside, but this is something we cannot measure so far. We don't know how it works. And of course, I guess we would have the cue to any type of political, we would have a political explanation of why things are as they are if we could aggregate all the micro debates that people have in small groups. Because when you talk with your family, with friends, and you already test your ideas, for example, about migrants, about refugees. Should we accept more refugees or less? Should we accept refugees here? Should they be my next neighbors or not? And so you can have discussions with your neighbors about that, and then this discussion can be relayed by a discussion with your peers on the workplace, and then if you are in the university, you can discuss this with your students or with your professors. And eventually, all this will come to some sort of a consensus. And this consensus will be, for example, that at some point we have to reform, we have to skip public expenses, cut public expenses. We have to. That's the consensus which has been achieved by myriads, millions, billions of mini discussions. And so we don't know how it works. But mainly, we should at least try to find out a way to see how the bridge between the public with minor p and the public with a capital P, which is composed of the one who makes policy, who make policy.
Okay, so let's wait and see what happens.
Yes, the good news for the students is that maybe you've noticed that from Yves' last slide, is that the most sophisticated among you can resist persuasion, unless you are anxious.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.